Just like we have those ebbs and flows, I do want to apologize that I'm actually going through one of those right now, actually. My voice has been a little bit shaky. It's one of those things that I lose my voice about every 2 years. It's almost like clockwork, but I actually told some people Thursday that I was probably going to lose my voice this weekend. So I do ask for your patience, and I thank you for that. As we get started, with this last week, with all of the random weather, it's really put Tucson on my mind. Like in Tucson where it gets really cold down to like 50. And I've been thinking about that, with everything that's been kind of going on. Because when Morgan and I lived in Tucson, we really loved going to the vet. I know that seems like maybe it's a weird thing to really enjoy, but the reason was that our vet, his name was Rob, and he was just amazing. He was one of those people who was just like born to be a vet, and we actually met Rob at our church. His wife was one of those people that, like, when she would walk into a room, like, everyone would turn and look to see what she was going to say, 'cause she was just a firecracker. She was one of those people, she was one of our lead musicians, she was a preschool teacher, and she just, like, lit up a room. And Rob was kind of the quiet version of that, right? He was the kind that liked to read, he liked to hike, he played indoor soccer. But when he showed up at the vet, when he was in his office, he came alive. It was almost like not only could he speak dog, but he could like speak Dachshund, right? Like he knew the dialects, right? He was the kind of person that I truly believe could have gotten a cat to come on call, or could have taught a fish how to sit. Don't try to picture that, that's kind of weird, but no matter what he did, I realistically think that if there were like a trillion multiverses, that in every single one of those multiverses, including the one where he's an elephant, he's a vet. And so it was just amazing to me the way that he could do that and the way that he was always so good. I don't know if you've ever met someone who was like that, like it was just that natural that they did what they did. On the extreme opposite end of that, I recently ran across a term that I'd never heard before that kind of describes the flip side of that. It's a term that Frank Weishout, who's the CEO of Owl Labs, started, and he said it's called coffee badging. I don't know if you've ever heard of coffee badging. Here's what he says about it. He says coffee badging was a term that Owl Labs coined as a part of its 2023 State of the Hybrid Work Report. And what we found was that employees were coffee badging. Some were just going in to show face, grab a cup of coffee, say hi to some of their colleagues, maybe their boss, so they could check the box for their company's return to office mandates. In other words, the one side of this coin of the things that kind of drive us was Rob, who just like was intended from the very day that he was born to be what he was. And the other side was these people who are saying, like now that we've kind of had the return to office mandates from COVID, let me just like grab my cup of coffee, swipe my badge, and that'll be good enough. And then I can go back to what I really like, which is the more hybrid. Interestingly enough, by the way, Weishout doesn't think there's anything wrong with that. He actually thinks that that's a good trend as we're moving to 2024, 2025, et cetera, that it's setting up a little bit more balance between our work lives and our home lives and all of those pieces. But it is a good indication, I think, of where people's fire burns, where their indication is, or where their purpose really lies. I had a boss when I used to work at MCI, which MCI sold long distance, and if you're under 25 and you don't know what long distance is, ask someone who's older. But we used to do this, and I had a boss there who said, you either live to work or you work to live, and really either is fine. You just need to know what you're doing, okay? And I really think that there is some truth to that. It's about where we really get fueled up. It's the question, by the way, that we started looking at last week as we started this new series on Embers, the things that really fuel us, the things that are already there within us burning, and sometimes we just have to discover them just a little bit. We've been looking at this notion of embers, and I do want to think today for just a moment about the fact that embers are a really interesting metaphor for many of us, because they're things that can be great, right? Like if you're camping and you need to keep warm during this type of weather, you maybe have a fireplace, it can help keep you warm. But we also know at the same time, there's all kinds of devastation going around right now with the forest fires in LA and I just read this morning, I think the number is 16 people who have already been confirmed dead. It's a tragedy. And we look at these things and we're like, how do we hold these two things, these things that are kind of contradictory and complex? The teaching over this month largely got inspired from a poem that Whitney introduced to us that was read by Ram Dass. You heard it just before I came out here. And I want to read just a small section to you because I think it's really important as we're kind of getting into this. It says this: as if in each of us there once was a fire, and for some of us there seem as if there are only ashes now. But when we dig in the ashes, we find one ember. And so today, what I'd like us to do for about the next 27 minutes or thereabouts is this. I'd like us to think about what that ember is within us. What is the fire inside of you that is already there, that is already enlightened, like what Philip was speaking about last week? What is that thing within us that we can already start to find, and how can we cultivate that? I think when we do that, I think there is one text in the Bible that helps explain this really well. It's a text, by the way, that shows up not only in the Christian scriptures, it's in the Hebrew scriptures because it's in the Old Testament. It's also in the Quran, by the way. It's a story that if you grew up in church, you might have been familiar with. It's the beginning of this story that many people believe is probably one of the most important stories in the Old Testament, the story of the Exodus, which is this story where God ultimately shows up and partners with those who had long been oppressed. And that we start to see that a character of God is that God is one who partners to help free those who have oftentimes been left behind. And it starts in Exodus chapter 3, and I want to read this to you to kind of get us started, and it says this: that one day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He had led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amusement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. This is amazing, Moses said to himself. Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it. And so just to kind of set the stage here, this guy named Moses, this guy who would eventually, if you grew up in church, you might have known that he was like the guy that collected the 10 Commandments, or that he like split the Red Sea, that he was the one who helped free the Hebrew people who had been enslaved by the Egyptians. He was just kind of going about his day, though. This is pre all of that. He was just tending sheep. And then he notices up on this mountain that there's this fire. But there's something unique about it. It's a fire in that it looks like a fire, but it's not burning up the bush. The bush is not being consumed. And as I was kind of thinking about, like, why in the world would this story show up? I was kind of thinking about, like, the fact that whenever it was written, it wasn't like Moses was going around with, like an iPad writing down notes really quickly as he was doing this. Most scholars believe that this story was probably recorded somewhere between the 5th and 6th century BCE. And so this was way after the time when most people would have assumed that Moses would have been around. And they would have been writing this story to kind of show off who God was for them, okay? And at that time, a lot of the other gods and other religions around that area were really trying to show off the fire part as well. In fact, the main god, or one of the main gods in Egypt, which is where the Hebrew people had been, was the god Ra. This god was the Egyptian god of the sun, of creation, and of fire. And he was worshipped, like I said, as one of the main gods, starting in about 2600 BCE. And part of the extension of the fact that he was the creator god was that he had the ability to contain fire, that he had the ability to, like, gift fire to humanity. And so what they're starting to do here is they're starting to show, okay, like, fire, this exploration of fire is a really important concept. On the other side of the world, the Hindu religion, Ani, they also had a god of fire. And I think it's really interesting, by the way, if you look at this picture and most pictures of Ani, you'll notice that they almost always have two heads. And that is because they realize from the very get-go that fire can be both creative and destructive. And it's kind of this conflict that this story exists in, right? That people were starting to realize that fire had benefits and drawbacks. It had ups and it had downs. It had the ability to burn up a bush, but yet it seemed in this instance that the God who was creating this fire had control of it enough to not engulf the bush. It kind of actually reminds me, if you've ever heard of, like, Schrodinger's cat, Like the question of like, if there's a cat in a box, you can't really tell if it's alive or not, so it's both like alive and not alive at the same time. I had the same experience actually not too long ago with my voicemail box, actually. I want to show you this. This was an actual screenshot of my voicemail. If you see up at the top, it says, can't receive new voicemails. Your inbox is full. Try deleting some messages to receive new voicemail. And then if you look inside my actual voicemail box, it says, your voicemail box is empty. Not that anyone answers voicemails anyway. But that's actually kind of where I want to get started today, is to talk about the fact that when we're talking about this ember that is within us, that is already there, that we're trying to cultivate, that sometimes it can be confusing. And so this is kind of the first part that I want to land on today, is this, that trying to find your one thing can start with a lot of confusion, okay? Trying to find your one thing can start with a lot of confusion. Moses is super confused here. Like I said, he looks up and this bush is both burning and not burning, it seems like at the same time. And if you think about it, right, fire is kind of complex. You all might know that I'm a huge fan of Survivor. And whether it's Survivor or whether it's camping, you know that once you start a fire, one of the things that you have to do is you have to like blow on it to get it to expand, to get to be a bigger fire, which is the exact opposite of what we're taught as little kids, right? One of our first memories of fire for most of us is like we're 2 or 3 years old and our parents have a cake and it has candles on it, and we're told like blow them out, which by the way, in a post-COVID world, that seems really weird, right? Like we definitely know that kids aren't carriers of germs, so let's just have them spit all over our food, right? Yeah, that seems wise. But we know that these types of things can be confusing, and even in 2025, we know that as we are trying as individuals or collectively to figure out what our one thing is, what is our passion, what is the ember within us, we know that it can be really confusing. We know that there are things that we're trying to figure out. Where do I spend my time? Where do I spend my energy? Where do I spend my money? Where do I spend my effort? And we know that when you do this, that it's honestly, it's not like you're trying to make decisions between a good thing and a bad thing. Oftentimes, you're like trying to make a decision between two things that are good, and you're like, yeah, they both could be pretty okay. Or you're trying to make decisions about two things that are honestly pretty terrible, and you're just trying to figure out which one's the least bad, right? I mean, it's not like we're making decisions about chocolate cake or shards of glass. It's not that complicated. We're making very complex decisions. Let me give you 4 indications of decisions that I've talked to people recently about that they've been trying to make. Questions like this: do I move and take a higher paying job, or do I stay where I have a built-in community? It's a complicated question. Questions like, do I come out and live as my true self, even if it means it costs me many of my current relationships? It's a complicated question. Or is it time to retire and spend time with my loved ones? Or am I going to end up without enough savings? Again, not an easy decision. Or the last one here, should I stay in an unhappy relationship for the sake of the kids or because of convenience, right? We definitely know people that wrestle through. Let me say honestly, that on all of these are not questions that there's like an easy book answer to, right? That I know people who say like, maybe I should. I know people who say like, if I move, it might work out great. And I also know people who've moved and it didn't. I know people who are part of the queer community who have come out to their family, and it's been awesome, and we want to celebrate that. And I know, unfortunately, there have been way too many stories where it hasn't been. And so just as a quick side note, let me say this. If you are one of my queer siblings today, and you know that for your safety, you need to stay in the closet, you are just as valid. You are just as affirmed. You are just as loved. And we will be a safe place for you here, but you just need to know that you are just as valid right where you are, whether you feel safe or not to come out of the closet. Absolutely. You need to know that. And also, by the way, on these others, whether you change your job, you change your family status, life gets messy, y'all. And if it does, understand that it's normal that it's confusing, because of course it is. Because of course it is, right? It's complicated. There's no right answer through these things. And the poem that we've based much of the series on, the one that played at the beginning of the teaching by Ram Dass, reminds us that sometimes it may take a little bit more time for us to find those embers. It may take a little bit more energy to find that one thing. Many of us have experienced our one thing in the past that really like got us to believing in things or really made us come alive. But many times there are societal pressures, life stuff or whatever, that just seem to get in the way. But even though life can be confusing, and even though trying to figure out what your one ember is can be confusing, I do think that as we read through the rest of this story, that there are some steps, there are some processes. And I don't want to sound trite with this because it's not a linear process, right? Life is not linear, there's ups and downs. But I think that as we look through this text, I think there are some things that we can pull out that might help us figure out how to deal with some of that confusion and how to develop our one thing. So I want to look at 3 things today that I think are key to helping us find and develop your one thing, okay? And the first is this, that curiosity often leads to calling. That curiosity often leads to calling. You see, when I was growing up, I was always taught that if you could just learn enough or study enough or whatever, you could figure out God. As if that was the goal, by the way. And it makes sense, right? If where I grew up, it was this world of just do more Bible studies, just do more devotions. In fact, we called them quiet times so that we could sit there and read, because it seems like the notion was if I could just figure out God, that I'd have it all figured out. I don't think that's the process, y'all. I don't think that that's the path. I don't think that's an accurate portrayal of God, though. Look at this text from Exodus. It says that when the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of a bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses replied. It seems to me that, at least for Moses, and I could be wrong about this, but it seems to be that at least for Moses, that the encounter with God happened not because he was fully learned, but rather because he was curious. Rather because he was responding to this thing, this bush, that wasn't making any sense. And in a lot of ways this seemed weird to me, right? That we would have this notion that if I just am curious around God, that maybe I can find some kind of an answer. But in a lot of ways, it's not that different from the way that I was taught about prayer as I was growing up, right? If I just say the right words, that God would do the right thing. And I do want to say this, y'all. I know for so many of us, we have been taught that if you pray the right things, that God would answer in a certain way. And when it doesn't happen, it hurts. I know there are so many people right now who are praying for the people who are in Los Angeles, and it doesn't make their homes come back. It doesn't make their lives easier right now. It takes action sometimes, and it takes doing the thing to actually accomplish the goals. But I do want to also note here that it does seem like there is a piece that sometimes when people pray, when it's done well, it comes from a place of curiosity. Give me this knowledge, this wisdom. In fact, at the very end of the Bible, near the end of the Bible in the Christian New Testament, there's this text that I think is really wise. It comes out of James. It says this: "Anyone who needs wisdom should ask God, whose very nature is to give everyone without a second thought, without keeping score. Wisdom will certainly be given to those who ask." It seems that one of the core principles of wisdom, though, is knowing that you don't know everything. And I think maybe that's the part of prayer, right? If I could just pray things into existence, that would mean that I had infinite wisdom. But maybe this whole process of understanding a little bit more about the thing within us is understanding that we don't know it all yet. That there are things that we still don't understand. And I think that it's in that context where Moses is coming to this bush that he doesn't understand, that God calls to Moses. I wonder how often there are things that we don't do, the embers that we don't develop, because we think we already know it all. Or we think that we know it's not going to work, or we think that we've already tried all of the other things. In fact, I would even argue that it could often be that it's this lack of curiosity, that gets in the way. There's a book that Philip and Barbie and I are reading right now called The Compassionate Leadership. And it has this great quote in it that I think sets this whole piece. It says this, that curiosity starts with a beginner's mind. Try to see the situation and the person with fresh eyes instead of assuming that you know what they will say or how they will feel. I think it could be that part of the reason that we often don't find our one thing or our passion is because instead of starting with curiosity, we start to believe that we already have it all figured out. One person who did not do this was an individual by the name of Percy Spencer. In 1906, at 12 years old, he decided to drop out of elementary school, which, by the way, is not part of our KV curriculum, just to put at ease the minds of you who are parents here. Not a suggestion that I would make. But what he did is he dropped out of school and he decided he'd start working in a mill. And he worked in a mill for a while, and then when he was 18, he joined the military. And as 12-year-olds are often apt to do, he would often carry candy in his pockets, right? And this happened even until he was an adult. And the reality is that when he was 19, in 1945, he had a chocolate bar in one of his pockets as he was walking through some of the rooms in this building. And he noticed that as he walked by the radar machines, that they would melt. Kind of got him to wondering. And within a few years, he had developed a machine called a radar range that he was selling for about $3,000 a piece. It's a little machine that you might have heard of called a microwave. And I think it's been pretty influential in the way that our society functions nowadays. While we don't know exactly who said this about him, I love the sentiment that a 1958 Reader's Digest article said, quoting an unnamed MIT scientist. They said, "The educated scientist knows many things won't work. Piercy doesn't know what can't be done." And so I wonder this morning if many of us couldn't be helped by just forgetting the things that we've been told can't be done. By forgetting the fact that you've been told you can't do this, you can't be in this space, you can't do whatever. But maybe we need to forget those things. On a very specific faith level, I think many of the people who show up at the venues do so because of this exact reason. We've been told that you can't ask those questions, but here at the venues, we think those questions are awesome, actually. It's one of the reasons that we have Q&A time, and it's one of the reasons that if you look out in the lobby as you're walking out, the very top sign says that we value curiosity and skepticism, because we really think it's important that you ask these questions, that you wrestle through these things. Understand that Philip and I don't know everything there is to know. In fact, our sign as you drive out here says, we don't know either, right? I mean, that's the reality, and I think it's actually that posture that really puts us in the place that we need to be if we're going to find our one thing, if we're going to find and develop the ember within us. It really starts from that position. But when we do that, when we have that kind of skepticism, I know a lot of people are like, but Chris, this is so complicated. Life just feels so wishy-washy, and I don't understand that. So that's actually where I want to go with the second major direction here, and that's this, that a clear moment can help fight back destabilizing insecurity. When we don't know exactly what's going on, when we're curious, when we're asking these questions, it can feel like it's insecure, and that is normal. But having a clear moment can often fight back destabilizing insecurity. Anytime you make a big life change, there are those moments afterwards where you face doubts. And they're normal. They're perfectly okay, and they're not a bad thing. But often they can be really destabilizing. I remember when Morgan and I first moved to Morocco, that very first night, we were laying in a bed in a house that didn't have air conditioning. It was 98 degrees in the middle of the night. We didn't speak the language, and we were starting a new job the next morning, somewhere we didn't know where it was, and we didn't know how we were going to get there. And I remember after rolling around in this sweaty bed for 4 hours, we looked at each other and we're like, did we just make the biggest mistake of our life? And we decided, tomorrow morning we're going to get up, we're going to try it one time. If it doesn't work, we're going to try to book tickets back to the US and start over. Because we'd already sold everything that we had back in Tucson. Fortunately, it did work out. But I remember how destabilizing that was. And I know for many of us, we've had that experience before, right? You start a new job and 15 minutes in, you're like, what am I doing? or you get married and you realize that you've been planning for this wedding and now you have this person to live with. Right? Or you have a baby, and they bring you your child, and it dawns on you that you are this child's parent. And it can feel really destabilizing. Honestly, by the way, sometimes you make those changes and it's not right. It doesn't work. And sometimes it's okay to move back in with your family or ask for help. But I think really the biggest difference between whether it's destabilizing or not is often if there is that moment where we can look back and be like, yep, that's why I did this. Moses experiences this, by the way. In the story it says this, "Do not come any closer," the Lord warned. "Take off your sandals, for you're standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. As Moses was approaching this bush, God spoke back to him and told him that where he was holy ground. And that was a little bit confusing to me because why is this, there's just a fire, why is it holy? You see, the word holy just means separate. It just means apart from, it means special, unique. It means very different from everything else. Let me put it this way. This is maybe the best illustration I can give of this. In my life, I've probably had 1,000,000 cups of coffee. I love coffee. And there's one way to drink it, black. Right? Right? I knew John would agree with me on that. But here's the thing. Out of those millions, I've forgotten most of them. But this coffee right here, this is holy coffee to me. It literally is holy ground. And the reason is, this is the coffee that we served at our wedding. And it was a special blend. We took some dark roast that kind of exemplified the more robust me, and some lighter roast that was a little bit more reserved for Morgan. And we blended it together and we served it at our wedding. And so while I will never drink this, not only because it's stale, but because it's sacred, right? I think when Moses was experiencing this, what he was experiencing was a place where it was holy, it was separate, it was different. Moses would have these insecurities, but there would be a place that he could look back at and be like, that's right, that's how that happened. I remember that moment when God and I had this conversation. It's part of the reason, by the way, that we think ceremonies here at the venues are good, right? There's a reason next week we're doing a baptism, because sometimes you need that moment that you can look back and be like, I remember that time when everyone affirmed me in who I am and that I'm loved. It's the reason we do things like communion. It's the reason that we think celebrating graduations or when kids move from kids venue up to students venue, we think it's awesome because people need those moments, those like touch points, those hook points. Dr. Rebecca Dyer explains another unique reason why this space would have been so holy for Moses. She says this, imagine a bush on fire, the flames continuously fluctuating, never precisely the same, and yet always remaining fire. In its constant motion, fire contains infinite expressions of itself, continuous and unbroken iterations of its nature created anew in each moment. Applied to selfhood, whether divine or human, the image of fire evokes a constant unfolding revelation. When Moses and the disciples recognize the self-disclosure of God in these theophanies, their own identities are cast in a new light. In other words, this theophany, which, by the way, if you ever want to like impress people at a cocktail party or get beaten up, just tell them you know what theophany means. It's basically like when God shows up in some kind of a form, okay? Like when God shows up in some kind of a physical manifestation. That when that happened, that Moses understood both something unique about God, and that is that the flames never had the same sizes. They were always different, just like God is always evolving in the way that we understand God, right? That, by the way, many scholars believe that this theophany was the first time in human history that God showed up without a gender, by the way. That God had always been recognized as some kind of a gendered creation. But this fire doesn't have a gender, that this fire is beyond that. But it also enlightened Moses as to who Moses was, right? Because Moses could see himself better by standing next to that ember, by next to that fire, by next to that theophany. It showed a space where Moses could look back and remind him of the things he had learned and how he had changed. And it's in that moment, by the way, that I think that when we see that, we can really get our last point today. And I want to share this with you to say this, that while it won't always be easy, remember, it's not just about you, it's about helping others. While it won't always be easy, remember, it's not just about you, it's about helping others. One of the things that is beautiful about an ember is that it reflects each other. Like our fires burn brighter when they're closer, actually. Part of the reason for this entire series, part of the reason for this teaching this morning is because change is hard. But we all know that changes come, that we all know that they exist. And it could be that there are changes coming for you in this year that are going to be complicated. And so we want you to have that moment where you know what it is that is driving you in that place. Our goal is to walk through those changes together. I want you to see how this story ends with Moses. It says this, then the Lord told him, I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people Israel out of Egypt. But Moses protested to God, which, by the way, that's a pretty gutsy move. Protesting God. He says, who am I to appear before Pharaoh? Who am I to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt? And God answered, I will be with you, and this is your sign that I am the one who has sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God at this very mountain. You see, just like in the Hindu version of Anyi, there are two ways that our changes can happen. Sometimes our changes can be really life-giving. Sometimes they can be really destructive. But I think that if we're going to have changes that are life-giving, it honestly is because it reflects the embers in each other. We often say here things like, the Christ in me sees the Christ in you. The ember in me reflects the ember in you. When Moses says that he has doubts, he's able to look back at that space, and God is able to say, right, but you need to know that your one thing is going to help free the oppressed. There are many people who use their power and their privilege in bad ways, and we know this. We've heard of pastors and politicians and others who have used the things that they have been given to really oppress people. I don't think that's a change that is honoring to love at all. But I think there are times where that does happen. So I want to close today by sharing with you a story where it did. When I was a kid, there was a musician that I really loved by the name of Rich Mullins. He came to fame in the Christian music circles because he wrote this song called Awesome God, and everyone was playing it everywhere. And the record companies kept coming to Rich and being like, why don't you let us do some more stuff with this? And he was like, not interested, not my jam. See, when he did his music concerts, all he wanted to do was sit on stage in a t-shirt and jeans and take his shoes off because he thought that when he played music with his crowd, that suddenly he was on holy ground. There's a story that I want to share with you that John Rivers, who was the vice president of programming for one of the radio stations in Dallas, shared. Because there was this Christian music award ceremony called the Dove Awards. It's like the JV version of the Grammys. And here's what he said at this thing. He said, it was the usual fancy banquet with all sorts of food, and everybody was all dressed up. All of the servers were in white dress coats and white caps, and the chefs were running to and fro and making sure everything was all right. I was walking down the dessert line, and as I got up to this one dessert, I noticed that standing behind the counter serving was Rich Mullins, who had relieved one of the workers, donned the cap and jacket, and he stood there the rest of the night serving people dessert, although I'm not sure that half the people knew who he was. That made a big statement to me that nothing mattered to him except the gospel. You see, even though he was getting these major awards, he decided that the people who were essential workers were the ones that he should be honoring, even if he never got recognized. When the word gospel is used most of the time, by the way, in the New Testament, it's used as this notion of good news to the oppressed, good news to the poor, good news to others. And so here's my challenge for you. As you're finding that ember within you, as you're finding that one thing within you, my prayer and my hope is that you find an ember that reflects the embers in other people and that you just burn. That you let that fire burn because the Christ in me sees the Christ in you and the Christ in you sees the Christ in others. That's my prayer for us this week. Let's pray. God, our prayer this week is that as we find our thing, our one thing, whatever that is, our ember, that it would shine brightly enough that it would let everyone around know that they are loved, that that fire in them is already there and that we see it and that we love them because of it. It's in the name of love, in the name of God we pray. Amen.